Hey guys, tonight we explore one of the most spectacularly disastrous love lives in royal history, the 6 wives of Henry VIII. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before Henry VIII became England's most famous husband, most famous ex-husband, and arguably England's first king to treat marriage like a renewable resource, he was simply Prince Henry Tudor, and life was good, very good. Henry was born in 1491 as the second son of King Henry VII. In royal families, being the second son was often the ideal position. You received the castles, the servants, the expensive education, and the fancy clothes without having to constantly worry about plots, rebellions, invasions, or whether your cousin was secretly building support to overthrow you. Those were problems for your older brother. Arthur Tudor was the golden child. Arthur was the future king. Arthur was the carefully packaged answer to England's recent history of civil war. Arthur's job was to inherit the throne and continue the Tudor dynasty. Henry's job was essentially to exist nearby and not cause problems. History unfortunately had other plans. As a young prince, Henry seemed almost absurdly gifted. He was intelligent, athletic, charismatic, and well-educated. He studied theology, languages, music, philosophy, and history. He excelled at hunting, dancing, jousting, and tennis. In fact, if you met Henry at age 18, you would probably have predicted a glorious reign filled with prosperity and wise leadership. You probably would not have predicted 6 wives, or 2 beheadings, or a religious revolution, or an entire generation of English nobles quietly wondering whether attending a royal wedding was becoming a dangerous career move. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 1502, Arthur suddenly died at just 15 years old. The kingdom was shocked. The Tudor dynasty was alarmed, and Henry instantly found himself promoted from spare prince to future king. His father was not thrilled by this development, not because Henry was unqualified, but because losing your primary heir was a bit like discovering your backup parachute was now your main parachute. The dynasty needed stability. More importantly, it needed alliances. Fortunately, Arthur had already married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand, and Isabella of Spain. This marriage connected England to one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Unfortunately, Arthur had also died before producing children. This created an awkward diplomatic problem. England wanted to keep the Spanish alliance. Spain wanted to keep the alliance too. And so someone suggested a solution that sounded perfectly reasonable at the time. Why not marry Catherine to Henry instead? Simple, elegant, potentially illegal. The church generally disapproved of a man marrying his brother's widow. There were biblical passages involved. Theologians argued. Lawyers debated. Clergymen wrote lengthy opinions that absolutely nobody reads for fun today. Eventually, a special papal dispensation was granted. Problem solved. Or at least everyone thought it was solved. The funny thing about history is that some of its biggest disasters begin as paperwork. A few signatures were exchanged. Some royal hands were shaken. A diplomatic agreement was celebrated. And somewhere in Europe, fate quietly opened a notebook and began writing the first chapter of what would become the most expensive midlife crisis in English history. In 1509, Henry finally became king. His father, Henry VII, died after years of carefully managing England's finances, avoiding unnecessary wars, and generally behaving like a cautious accountant who happened to wear a crown. Young Henry immediately decided to do the opposite. He was 18 years old, athletic, charismatic, and enormously popular. England suddenly had a king who looked like he had stepped directly out of a Renaissance painting. Crowds loved him. Foreign ambassadors praised him. Noble families wanted to be near him. And almost immediately, Henry married Catherine of Aragon. At first, it looked like a perfect match. Catherine was 6 years older than Henry, but she brought qualities few queens could match. She was intelligent, deeply educated, politically experienced, and the daughter of 2 of Europe's most powerful rulers. Unlike many royal brides, she was not simply decorative furniture wearing expensive clothing. She could speak several languages, understood diplomacy, and possessed enough confidence to stand toe-to-toe with powerful men without blinking. For nearly 20 years, their marriage appeared remarkably successful. Henry adored her. Catherine adored him. England approved. Even better, Catherine proved herself an effective queen. When Henry went to France on military campaigns, she governed England in his absence. During one Scottish invasion, she helped organise England's defence. The Scots were defeated at the Battle of Flodden. Legend claims Catherine even sent Henry part of the defeated Scottish king's armour as a victory trophy. Not bad for someone many foreign rulers still viewed as merely a royal wife. But beneath the celebrations, a problem was quietly growing. Children, or more accurately, the heartbreaking lack of surviving children. Catherine became pregnant many times. Several babies died shortly after birth. Others were stillborn. One son survived only a few weeks. Each loss devastated the royal couple. Eventually, only one child lived into adulthood, Princess Mary. Mary was healthy, intelligent, and by all accounts a capable heir. There was just one issue. She was a girl. To modern audiences this sounds absurd. To Henry and many people of his time it sounded terrifying. England had never successfully passed the crown directly to a ruling queen. Memories of past civil wars remained fresh. Henry became increasingly convinced that without a son, the Tudor dynasty might collapse after his death. At first he tried to remain optimistic, then worried, then obsessed, and as the years passed, Henry began searching for explanations. Soon he would convince himself that the answer wasn't bad luck. The answer, he believed, was that God himself disapproved of his marriage. Conveniently, this realization arrived around the same time Henry started paying very close attention to a young woman named Anne Boleyn. If Henry had simply fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, history might have remained relatively peaceful. Unfortunately, Henry never did anything halfway. Anne arrived at court as part of Catherine of Aragon's household. She was not the most conventionally beautiful woman in England, at least according to contemporary descriptions, but she possessed something far more dangerous. She was interesting. Anne was intelligent, witty, fashionable, confident, and capable of holding her own in conversation. She had spent years in the sophisticated courts of France and brought with her an elegance that made many English nobles seem painfully provincial. Most importantly, Anne made a decision that would completely alter English history. She refused to become Henry's mistress. This was highly inconvenient. Kings were accustomed to hearing the word yes. Henry was especially accustomed to hearing the word yes. Yet Anne repeatedly refused to become merely another royal affair. If Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her. This was not the answer Henry had expected. At first he tried patience, then gifts, then letters. Lots of letters. Some of Henry's surviving love letters reveal a man who was completely captivated. He wrote about longing, affection, frustration, and devotion. Reading them today can feel strangely familiar, except most people don't respond to romantic frustration by dismantling centuries of religious authority. Henry, however, was not most people. As the years passed, he became increasingly convinced that his marriage to Catherine was invalid. The fact that Catherine had failed to provide a surviving son only strengthened his belief, or at least that was the official explanation. Many people suspected the real explanation had dark hair, fashionable French gowns, and the surname Boleyn. Soon Henry began seeking an annulment from Pope Clement VII. The Pope found himself trapped. Granting the request would anger Catherine's nephew, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Refusing the request would anger Henry. The Pope chose delay, then more delay, then even more delay. This strategy works surprisingly well against ordinary people. It works less well against kings, especially kings who are deeply in love, increasingly impatient, and surrounded by advisors eager to tell them exactly what they want to hear. Years passed. Henry grew more frustrated. Anne grew more influential. The Pope grew more nervous. And somewhere across England, thousands of monks quietly continued their daily routines without realizing they were about to become innocent bystanders in what was rapidly evolving into the world's most destructive courtship. Because Henry was no longer asking for permission. He was beginning to wonder what would happen if he simply stopped asking altogether. By the late 1520s, Henry had a problem. Actually, he had several problems. He still had no surviving son. He was still married to Catherine of Aragon. He was still in love with Anne Boleyn. and the Pope was still refusing to give him the answer he wanted. For years, Henry had convinced himself that God was unhappy with his marriage. The evidence, according to Henry, was obvious. No son, no male heir, no secure future for the Tudor dynasty. Never mind that Catherine had given birth multiple times. Never mind that infant mortality was tragically common throughout Europe. Henry increasingly focused on one particular verse from the book of Leviticus, which suggested that a man who married his brother's widow would remain childless. This interpretation conveniently ignored the daughter he already had. Princess Mary would probably have appreciated being counted. Instead, Henry became obsessed with obtaining an annulment. Catherine, meanwhile, refused to cooperate. She insisted her marriage to Arthur had never been fully consummated, and that her marriage to Henry was completely legitimate. She remained stubbornly dignified throughout the entire ordeal. This was unfortunate for Henry because it is much easier to divorce someone when they agree to be divorced. Then there was the Pope. Poor Pope Clement VII found himself trapped between two angry rulers. On one side stood Henry. On the other side stood Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew. And Charles happened to control armies. Large armies. The kind of armies that encouraged careful decision-making. The Pope delayed. He investigated. He postponed. He requested more evidence. Then he delayed some more. Henry's frustration grew into fury. Around him, ambitious advisers began suggesting a radical idea. What if England simply ignored the Pope? At first, this seemed outrageous. The Pope had been the spiritual authority of Western Europe for centuries. Kings argued with popes. Kings negotiated with popes. Kings occasionally threatened popes. They generally did not replace them. Henry eventually decided he was willing to try. Parliament passed laws reducing papal authority in England. Church officials were pressured into supporting the king. One by one, old barriers disappeared. Then came the truly astonishing moment. Henry declared himself supreme head of the church in England. Just like that, the English Reformation was underway. An entire religious revolution had begun. Officially, it involved theology, sovereignty, and national independence. Unofficially, many observers could not help noticing that the whole thing started because a king desperately wanted to marry a woman who kept telling him no. For Anne Boleyn, victory finally seemed close. For Catherine of Aragon, the battle was almost lost. And for thousands of monks living peacefully in monasteries across England, disaster was quietly approaching at full speed, although they had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. After years of waiting, arguing, plotting, negotiating, and accidentally helping to create a new church, Anne Boleyn finally achieved her goal. In 1533, she became Queen of England. On paper, this should have been the happy ending. Henry had spent nearly 7 years pursuing her. He had challenged the Pope, defied much of Europe, and overturned centuries of religious tradition to make this marriage possible. Surely a man who had worked this hard to marry someone would remain happy for at least a little while. History, however, was preparing one of its favourite jokes. At first, everything looked promising. Anne was crowned in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The celebrations were extravagant. Supporters believed a new golden age was beginning. Most importantly, Anne was pregnant. Everyone expected the long-awaited male heir to arrive at any moment. Then the baby was born. It was a girl. That girl was Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs. The problem was that nobody knew this yet. Henry had spent years chasing a son. Instead, he received another daughter. To be fair, he initially seemed pleased. Elizabeth was healthy and strong, but beneath the smiles, disappointment lingered. The son still had not arrived. As months passed, the atmosphere around the royal court began to change. Anne discovered that being queen was considerably harder than becoming queen. For years, she had been the exciting new possibility. Now she was expected to deliver results. Specifically, one very small male result. Meanwhile, Henry's personality was beginning to evolve. The charming athlete of his youth was slowly becoming more suspicious, more stubborn, and less willing to tolerate opposition. Court factions emerged. Some nobles supported Anne, others hated her. Many blamed her for Catherine's downfall. Others simply feared her influence. Anne herself did not help matters. She was intelligent and outspoken, two qualities that many 16th century men found deeply alarming in a woman, especially when she disagreed with them. Then came more pregnancies. One ended in miscarriage. Another ended in heartbreak. Each failure increased Henry's frustration. The king, who had once written passionate love letters, now seemed increasingly distant. The woman he had once considered worth a religious revolution was gradually becoming another obstacle, standing between him and the son he desperately wanted. And somewhere in the background stood a quiet lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. Unlike Anne, Jane rarely argued. Unlike Anne, Jane appeared gentle and obedient. And before long, Henry began noticing her. For Anne Boleyn, this was very bad news. After all, she knew better than anyone what happened when Henry became interested in someone new. By 1536, Anne Boleyn's position was becoming dangerously unstable. The fairy tale was over. The romantic letters were gone. The king who had once challenged the Pope for her now spent more time noticing Jane Seymour than paying attention to his wife. In Tudor England, this was roughly equivalent to hearing ominous music before a disaster. Anne's greatest problem remained the same one that had haunted Catherine of Aragon: no surviving son. She had given Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but Henry's obsession with a male heir had only grown stronger. Every failed pregnancy increased the pressure. Every miscarriage weakened Anne's position. Then came January 1536. Catherine of Aragon died. This should have been good news for Anne. Her greatest rival was finally gone. Instead, things somehow became worse. Only weeks later, Anne suffered another miscarriage. This time, according to several accounts, the lost child was a boy. For Henry, it was devastating. Years of waiting, years of fighting, years of political chaos, and still no son. Around this time, many people noticed a dramatic shift in the king's behaviour toward Anne. The affection disappeared. The patience disappeared. The loyalty disappeared. In their place came coldness. Meanwhile, powerful enemies at court sensed opportunity. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, one of Henry's most important advisers. Cromwell and Anne had increasingly disagreed on political and religious matters. Their relationship deteriorated rapidly. When powerful people at the Tudor court disliked you, it was rarely a minor inconvenience. Soon rumours began spreading, then accusations, then more accusations. According to investigators, Anne had committed adultery with multiple men. Not just one, multiple. Musicians, courtiers, noblemen, and eventually even her own brother were dragged into the scandal. The accusations were shocking. Many were also highly questionable. Several modern historians consider the charges extremely doubtful, if not completely fabricated. Some of the alleged meetings could not possibly have happened, because Anne was documented elsewhere at the time. Unfortunately, 16th century criminal investigations did not always prioritize the details. Once Henry became convinced, or decided to become convinced, the outcome was practically inevitable. Men were arrested, confessions were extracted, trials were arranged, the verdicts arrived quickly. Anne defended herself courageously, maintaining her innocence throughout the proceedings. It did not matter. On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed inside the Tower of London. She had been queen for less than 3 years. The woman Henry once considered worth overturning a kingdom for was gone. And in one final detail that historians still find astonishing, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour almost immediately afterward. Some men take time to process a breakup. Henry apparently preferred efficiency. If Anne Boleyn's fall was fast, Henry's recovery was even faster. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. 11 days. For comparison, some wedding guests probably still hadn't made it home from the previous marriage. Jane had been quietly waiting in the background for months. Unlike Anne, she wasn't known for sharp debates or ambitious political opinions. She cultivated an image of gentleness, modesty, and obedience. After years of arguing with Catherine and sparring with Anne, Henry may have found this refreshingly peaceful. Or perhaps he was simply exhausted. Either way, Jane became queen. To be fair, Jane was probably smarter than her image suggested. In the Tudor court, surviving often required appearing less threatening than you actually were. Jane understood exactly what had happened to the 2 women before her. One had been divorced. One had been executed. This was not a workplace where mistakes were encouraged. As queen, Jane avoided many of the controversies that had consumed Anne. She focused on restoring harmony within the royal family. One of her most important achievements involved Princess Mary. Ever since Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Mary had been treated harshly. She had been declared illegitimate and forced into a humiliating position. Jane encouraged reconciliation. Eventually, Mary returned to her father's favour. This made Jane popular with many people at court. More importantly, it made Henry happy. And keeping Henry happy was perhaps the most valuable skill anyone could possess in 16th century England. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. In October 1537, Jane gave birth. The entire kingdom held its breath. At last, after years of frustration, religious upheaval, broken marriages and political chaos, Henry got what he wanted. A son, Prince Edward. Church bells rang. Celebrations erupted. Messengers raced across England carrying the news. Henry was ecstatic. After nearly 3 decades of hoping, worrying, and occasionally restructuring national institutions, he finally had a legitimate male heir. The Tudor dynasty appeared secure. For a brief moment, it seemed like Henry had finally found happiness. History, however, had one more cruel surprise. Childbirth in the 16th century was incredibly dangerous. Days after Edward's birth, Jane became gravely ill. Despite the efforts of physicians, her condition worsened rapidly. On October 24th, 1537, Jane Seymour died. She was only around 28 years old. Henry was devastated. Unlike his previous marriages, this one had not ended in anger or disappointment. Jane had given him everything he wanted: a son, a peaceful household, a secure succession. For the rest of his life, Henry would regard Jane as his favourite wife. Not because she was necessarily the greatest queen, but because she was the only wife whose story ended exactly the way Henry wanted, which, considering Henry's track record, was a remarkably rare achievement. By 1538, Henry was once again unmarried. This had become something of a recurring theme. He was now approaching 50, considerably heavier than the athletic prince of his youth, and increasingly suffering from health problems. The old jousting injuries that had accumulated over the years left him in constant pain. His famous athletic figure was gradually being replaced by a waistline that required increasingly creative tailoring. Still, Henry remained a king, and kings needed queens. More importantly, England needed allies. Europe was becoming a dangerous place. France and the Holy Roman Empire were both powerful threats, and Henry's advisors wanted stronger connections with the Protestant states of Germany. The solution appeared in the form of Anne of Cleves. Anne was the sister of an important German duke. Politically, the match made perfect sense. There was only one problem. Henry had never met her. This was surprisingly normal for royal marriages. Kings generally didn't swipe through portraits while deciding who to marry, but they did rely heavily on official paintings. And so Henry sent his court painter, Hans Holbein, to create Anne's portrait. Holbein was one of the finest artists in Europe. His portrait looked excellent. Henry approved immediately. Negotiations moved forward. Wedding preparations began. Everyone seemed pleased, except they had forgotten one important detail. Portraits can sometimes be optimistic. In late 1539, Anne finally arrived in England. Henry, excited to meet his future bride, decided to surprise her by visiting in disguise. He imagined something romantic. Perhaps she would instantly recognize him. Perhaps sparks would fly. Perhaps history would remember it as a charming royal love story. Instead, Anne had absolutely no idea who this strange man was. She reportedly reacted with confusion rather than admiration. Henry was mortified. Things somehow became worse when they formally met. According to several accounts, Henry was disappointed by Anne's appearance and manners. Modern historians debate whether Anne was actually unattractive, or whether Henry had simply built impossible expectations in his head. Considering that Henry's expectations had previously caused an entire religious revolution, impossible expectations seem entirely plausible. Nevertheless, the wedding went ahead in January 1540. Henry complained almost immediately. The marriage was never consummated, according to Henry. He claimed he could not bring himself to fulfill his marital duties. This was a deeply embarrassing situation for everyone involved, especially the advisors who had enthusiastically recommended the match. Within months, Henry wanted another divorce. For Anne of Cleves, this should have been terrifying. After all, she had surely heard what happened to some of the previous wives. But Anne was about to handle the situation better than anyone could have imagined. If Anne Boleyn's story was a tragedy, and Catherine of Aragon's story was a long struggle, Anne of Cleves' story was something entirely different. It was a masterclass in survival. When Henry made it clear that he wanted out of the marriage, Anne faced a choice. She could resist. She could argue. She could insist on her rights as queen. She could fight the king. At this point, the historical record contains several examples demonstrating why this was a poor strategy. Anne wisely reviewed those examples. Then she did the exact opposite. When royal officials approached her about ending the marriage, Anne cooperated completely. No dramatic confrontations, no public complaints, no attempts to rally supporters. She essentially looked at the situation and concluded that remaining married to Henry might actually be the riskier option. Honestly, it is difficult to criticize that reasoning. The annulment process moved quickly. Henry claimed the marriage had never been properly completed. Anne agreed. Problem solved. For once, a royal marriage ended without executions, imprisonments, religious revolutions, or international crises. The bar had become remarkably low. Henry was delighted. Anne was rewarded generously, extremely generously. She received several estates, substantial income, servants, luxurious residences, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. This was an unusual title. Then again, most kings did not divorce their wives and promote them to honorary family member. Anne suddenly found herself in a remarkable position. She was wealthy. She was respected. She was free. Most importantly, she was alive, a quality that was becoming increasingly valuable among Henry's former spouses. Anne remained in England and adapted surprisingly well to English society. She attended court functions, maintained cordial relations with Henry, and even developed positive relationships with his children. Mary liked her. Elizabeth liked her. Even Henry generally liked her, which is probably the closest thing to a happy ending available in this story. Meanwhile, Henry's attention had already moved elsewhere, because while Anne was settling into her comfortable new life, the king had become fascinated by another young woman at court. Her name was Catherine Howard. She was young, lively, beautiful, and everything Henry hoped might make him feel young again. There was just one small problem. Henry was now nearly 50 years old, increasingly unhealthy, and moving into the stage of life where buying a horse is usually less expensive than having a midlife crisis. History was about to discover what happened when a middle-aged king desperately tried to convince himself that he was still 25. When Catherine Howard entered Henry's life, she was probably somewhere between 17 and 20 years old. Historians still argue about her exact age. What they do not argue about is that she was very young. Henry, meanwhile, was nearly 50. This meant there was roughly the same age difference between them as between Catherine and some of Henry's battle scars. The king, however, was enchanted. Absolutely enchanted. Catherine was cheerful, energetic, flirtatious, and full of life. After years of political struggles, failed marriages, and growing health problems, she represented something Henry desperately wanted to believe, that he was still young. This was a comforting illusion. Reality, unfortunately, remained stubbornly attached to facts. By this point, Henry was suffering from chronic pain, severe leg ulcers, limited mobility, and considerable weight gain. The athletic prince who had once dominated tournaments had largely disappeared, but Catherine made him feel youthful again, or at least youthful enough to forget that his doctors were becoming some of the busiest people in England. Henry showered her with gifts. Jewels, clothes, land, money, more jewels. If a merchant saw Catherine approaching, he probably started calculating profits immediately. The king adored her so completely that he referred to her as his rose without a thorn. History immediately responded by producing an entire bush of thorns. At first, everything appeared wonderful. Court celebrations returned. Henry smiled more often. Foreign ambassadors reported that the king seemed happier than he had in years. Then rumours began, and in Tudor England, rumours were like rats on a ship. If you spotted one, there were usually many more hiding nearby. Investigators discovered that before marrying Henry, Catherine had been involved in relationships with other men. Today, this might have produced awkward conversations. In the 16th century, it produced national panic. The situation became even worse when allegations surfaced that Catherine may have continued inappropriate relationships after becoming queen. Suddenly, the same court that had celebrated her rise began whispering about her downfall. Evidence was gathered, witnesses were questioned, former acquaintances were arrested. The atmosphere became increasingly grim. For Catherine, the situation was terrifying. For Henry, it was humiliating. The king, who had believed he found youthful happiness, suddenly found himself at the centre of another scandal. And perhaps the cruelest part was this. Henry genuinely loved Catherine, at least as much as he was capable of loving anyone, which meant that when the accusations became impossible to ignore, the consequences would be devastating for both of them. The kingdom had seen this story before, and everyone knew exactly how it usually ended. By late 1541, Catherine Howard's world was collapsing. The rumours that had once floated quietly through court corridors were now official accusations. And in Henry's England, there was a significant difference between gossip and an official investigation. Gossip could ruin your reputation. An official investigation could ruin your head. The trouble began when members of the King's Council uncovered details about Catherine's past. Witnesses were questioned. Old acquaintances were tracked down. Former servants suddenly found themselves having very stressful conversations with royal officials. The deeper investigators looked, the worse things became. Relationships from Catherine's youth were uncovered. Letters were examined. Testimonies were collected. Names appeared. Then more names appeared. Soon the government concluded that the Queen had deceived the king before marriage, and may have engaged in inappropriate relationships afterward. Whether every accusation was true remains debated by historians. What is not debated is that Catherine's position had become hopeless. At court, people began distancing themselves from her. Friends disappeared. Supporters became difficult to find. Those who had once praised her beauty and charm suddenly discovered urgent reasons to be somewhere else. A remarkable survival instinct often appeared among Tudor courtiers whenever execution seemed likely. Henry received the news while attending religious services. According to some accounts, he was devastated. For once, his reaction was not immediate anger. It was heartbreak. The aging king, who had lavished gifts upon Catherine, reportedly struggled to believe the accusations. For days he refused to accept them. Then the evidence continued arriving, and eventually even Henry could no longer ignore reality. The cheerful young queen who had made him feel young again was arrested. Catherine was taken to Sion Abbey and later transferred to the Tower of London, the same tower that Anne Boleyn had entered only a few years earlier. This was not encouraging. Inside her chambers, Catherine reportedly suffered periods of panic and despair. One famous story claims she practiced placing her head on the execution block so she could face death with courage. Whether true or not, it captures the tragedy of her final days. She was young, very young, far younger than most of the powerful men deciding her fate. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed. Before her death, she reportedly declared that she deserved to die a queen, though she would rather have died the wife of another man. With that, Henry's fifth marriage ended. 5 wives, 1 divorced, 2 executed, 1 dead from childbirth, 1 comfortably retired. The statistics were becoming difficult to ignore. Yet somehow, incredibly, Henry would soon decide that what he really needed was another wife. By 1543, Henry VIII was once again searching for a wife. At this point, one has to admire his optimism. Most people would have looked at the scoreboard and considered taking a break. Henry instead decided to try again. His next choice was Catherine Parr. Unlike Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr was not a teenager. She was a mature, intelligent widow with considerable life experience. She had already been married twice and understood exactly how dangerous the Tudor court could be. Most importantly, she understood Henry. This was a rare skill. By now, Henry was no longer the athletic prince who had dazzled Europe. He was an aging king suffering from painful leg ulcers, limited mobility, and frequent mood swings. His doctors constantly experimented with treatments that probably caused almost as much suffering as the illnesses themselves. Imagine living with chronic pain while being surrounded by people who were terrified of disagreeing with you. It was not an ideal environment for emotional stability. Catherine entered this situation with remarkable caution. In fact, she had initially been interested in marrying another man, Thomas Seymour. Unfortunately for her, Henry expressed interest first. And when the King of England joined a romantic competition, the competition usually ended immediately. The wedding took place in July 1543. Unlike several previous marriages, this one was based less on passion and more on practicality. Catherine was educated, calm, capable, and politically skilled. She quickly proved herself an excellent queen. She managed the royal household. She helped care for Henry during his illnesses. She acted as a stepmother to his children. Most impressively, she helped repair relationships within the royal family. Princess Mary returned to favour. Princess Elizabeth returned to favour. Even young Prince Edward benefited from her guidance. For the first time in years, the royal family began functioning like something resembling a family, at least by Tudor standards. Which is to say, nobody was currently being investigated for treason. Catherine also loved books. She enjoyed discussing religion and theology. This became a slight problem. Henry enjoyed discussing theology too. The difference was that Henry expected to win every theological debate. Eventually, Catherine became confident enough to challenge some of his opinions. This was a dangerous hobby. Several conservative advisors noticed. Soon whispers began circulating around court, and before long, Catherine Parr would discover that even surviving 5 previous wives did not necessarily guarantee survival as the 6th. After all, this was still Henry VIII, and Henry had never let a good pattern stop him from creating another crisis. Catherine Parr had one enormous advantage over Henry's previous wives. She paid attention. By the time she became queen, she knew exactly how dangerous the position could be. She had seen 1 queen divorced, 2 executed, 1 die in childbirth, and another successfully negotiate her way into retirement. This was not a role that encouraged complacency. For several years, Catherine managed things remarkably well. She cared for Henry during his illnesses, supervised the royal household, and maintained good relationships with his children. She was intelligent, educated, and deeply interested in religious reform. That last quality nearly got her killed. The 1540s were a tense period in England. The country had broken from Rome, but nobody completely agreed on what should happen next. Some wanted more Protestant reforms. Others wanted to preserve many traditional Catholic practices. Henry himself somehow managed to belong to both sides depending on the day. He had destroyed papal authority, but he also disliked many Protestant ideas. It was a theological position that often left everyone confused, including Henry. Catherine enjoyed discussing religion with scholars and intellectuals. She published books and openly supported reformist ideas. At first, Henry tolerated these conversations. Then he grew irritated, and some of Catherine's enemies saw an opportunity. Conservative courtiers began whispering in the king's ear. They suggested that the queen was becoming dangerously outspoken. Perhaps she was challenging royal authority. Perhaps she was spreading questionable religious ideas. Perhaps she was becoming a threat. Henry listened, which was unfortunate. Soon an arrest warrant was reportedly prepared. The Queen of England was in genuine danger, and the truly terrifying part was that Catherine had no idea. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that powerful men had spent weeks discussing whether you should be arrested for treason. That was essentially Catherine's situation. Fortunately for her, someone warned her in time. Catherine immediately understood the danger. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she did not fight. Unlike Catherine Howard, she did not panic. Instead, she employed the most effective survival strategy ever developed in the Tudor court. She agreed with Henry, completely. When Henry challenged her religious opinions, Catherine humbly explained that she never intended to teach or correct him. She merely asked questions so she could learn from his superior wisdom. This was an extraordinarily diplomatic way of saying, "Please don't execute me." Remarkably, it worked. Henry softened. The arrest plans disappeared. Her enemies were left frustrated, and Catherine survived. For perhaps the first time in decades, a wife had successfully navigated a crisis without losing her marriage, her freedom, or her head. The king was aging rapidly now, and for the first time in many years, it appeared that Henry's final marriage might actually remain intact until death separated them. Not Parliament, not the Pope, not an executioner, just death. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII was no longer the king who had dazzled Europe in his youth. The transformation was remarkable. The tall, athletic prince who once dominated jousting tournaments had become an aging ruler plagued by illness, pain, and frustration. Years of injuries, especially a devastating jousting accident in 1536, had left lasting damage. His famous leg ulcers refused to heal. Walking became difficult. Physical activity became rare. Food, however, remained very popular. Henry's waistline expanded dramatically. His armour from earlier years became little more than a historical memory. Some servants reportedly had to use special devices to help move the king from place to place. It was not exactly the image of a conquering Renaissance hero, yet despite his declining health, Henry remained one of the most powerful men in Europe. and one of the most feared. After decades of executions, political purges, religious upheaval, and shifting alliances, very few people were eager to tell him bad news. This created a problem. When everyone around you constantly agrees with you, reality becomes difficult to locate. Meanwhile, Henry's children were growing up. Mary remained fiercely intelligent and deeply Catholic. Elizabeth displayed the intelligence and political instincts that would later make her legendary. Young Edward, the long-awaited son, was being carefully educated as England's future king. Ironically, after spending much of his adult life obsessing over producing a male heir, Henry now had 3 children, who would each leave a larger historical legacy than most European monarchs. History occasionally enjoys irony. As Henry's health deteriorated, questions about succession became increasingly urgent. Who would rule after him? Would England remain stable? Would the religious changes survive? Would all the chaos of the previous 20 years have been worth it? Nobody knew. By late 1546, the king's condition was worsening rapidly. His mobility was limited. His pain was constant. The energetic prince who had once hunted across forests and competed in tournaments was gone. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died at the age of 55. His reign had lasted nearly 38 years. He left behind a transformed kingdom, a new church, a young heir, 3 future monarchs, and a marital record that probably made every widowed noblewoman in England breathe a small sigh of relief. For Catherine Parr, there was one final benefit. She had achieved something no other wife except Anne of Cleves had managed. She had outlived Henry. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he probably hoped history would remember him as a powerful king, a warrior king, a reformer, a ruler who strengthened England, a founder of a lasting dynasty. History listened carefully. Then it remembered the wives. 500 years later, millions of people who couldn't name a single law Henry passed can immediately recite the famous rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It is arguably the catchiest royal summary ever created, and probably not the legacy Henry had in mind. Looking back, the story of Henry's 6 wives feels almost impossible to believe. Catherine of Aragon began as the respected Spanish princess who stood beside him for nearly 24 years before being cast aside. Anne Boleyn inspired a king to challenge the Pope and reshape England's religion, only to lose everything when she failed to provide the son he wanted. Jane Seymour finally delivered that son and became the wife Henry cherished most, largely because fate ended the marriage before disappointment could arrive. Anne of Cleves turned a disastrous marriage into one of the best retirement packages in Tudor history. Catherine Howard discovered that being the object of Henry's affection could be considerably more dangerous than lacking it. And Catherine Parr somehow survived by mastering the rare art of agreeing with Henry at exactly the right moments. Taken together, the 6 women tell us something important. The story was never really about romance, it was about power, succession, fear, politics, religion, and one king's obsession with securing the future of his dynasty. Ironically, that obsession produced results Henry never expected. The daughter he rejected, Mary, became queen. The daughter Anne Boleyn gave him, Elizabeth, became one of the greatest monarchs in English history. And the son he spent decades pursuing, Edward, ruled for only a short time before dying young. History can be brutally sarcastic. Henry spent years rearranging an entire kingdom to secure a male heir. Then his daughters ended up overshadowing almost everyone involved. Perhaps the funniest part of all is that Henry's wives have become more famous than many kings. Entire books, films, television series, documentaries, and stage productions revolve around them. Not around Henry's laws. Not around Henry's financial policies, not around Henry's diplomatic achievements. The wives, the 6 women who entered one of the most dangerous marriages in Europe and somehow became legends. And so, centuries later, the king who desperately wanted to control how history remembered him remains famous for proving one timeless truth. If your solution to every marital problem is perhaps a different wife, eventually the wives become the story. The first thing you learn as a servant in a medieval castle is that your life belongs to someone more important than you. The second thing you learn is that some jobs are much worse than cleaning chamber pots. You are 14 years old when you first arrive at court. Your father is a tenant farmer. Your mother has spent years reminding you not to speak unless spoken to, and never to look a nobleman directly in the eye. Compared to ploughing muddy fields behind an exhausted ox, service in a castle sounds almost luxurious. At first it is. The kitchens are enormous. Fires burn day and night. Bakers produce mountains of bread. Barrels of ale line the walls. Cooks prepare roasted meats, pies, fish, vegetables and sauces, whose ingredients cost more than your family earns in months. The lord and his guests feast while musicians play nearby. Watching these meals, you might think the wealthy have solved every problem life can offer. Then you hear the whispers: a duke poisoned at a banquet, a bishop who collapsed after drinking wine, a noblewoman who died suddenly after eating sweetened fruit. Whether the stories are true hardly matters. People believe them, and that is enough. The castle exists in a world where trust is rare and ambition is common. Powerful men quarrel over land, titles, marriages, and inheritances. A smiling guest today may become an enemy tomorrow. A cousin may want a throne. A rival lord may want revenge. Sometimes a person can gain more through one poisoned cup than through an entire army. The fear reaches every corner of court life. One morning, the steward summons several young servants. Nobody knows why. The older staff exchange nervous glances but say little. That alone is enough to make your stomach tighten. The steward studies the group before pointing directly at you. You, come with me. No explanation follows. You are led through corridors toward the great hall. Servants rush past carrying silver dishes. Guards stand beside heavy doors. The smell of roasted venison fills the air. At the high table sits the lord himself, preparing for a feast attended by visiting nobles. The steward gestures toward a plate. You will taste first. For a moment you think you have been rewarded. Perhaps food from the lord's own table is some kind of privilege. Then the steward continues. If nothing happens, he will eat. Suddenly, the honour feels considerably less impressive. You stare at the meal. The hall falls silent. Every eye is on you. And for the first time you realise that protecting a lord's life may require risking your own. That first bite changes the way you see the castle forever. The roasted venison tastes perfectly normal. The bread is fresh. The wine is sweet. Nothing happens. After several anxious minutes, the lord begins eating, and conversation returns to the hall. But your relief does not last. As the feast continues, an older servant quietly explains the reality of your new position. The danger is not the food. The danger is the people around it. Medieval courts are crowded places filled with smiling faces and hidden motives. Noble families compete for influence. Wealthy merchants seek favours. Foreign ambassadors gather information. Relatives wait impatiently for inheritances. Every banquet brings together dozens of individuals who may have reasons to dislike one another. Most disagreements end with insults, lawsuits, or occasional violence, but poison offers something special. Unlike a sword, poison does not announce itself. A poisoned nobleman does not see an attacker charging across a battlefield. He simply grows sick after dinner. Perhaps he develops stomach pains. Perhaps he collapses unexpectedly. Perhaps everyone calls it a fever and asks no further questions. At least that is the theory. In reality, medieval people often knew very little about disease. Food poisoning, infections, contaminated water, and natural illnesses killed thousands every year. Determining whether someone had been deliberately poisoned was often impossible. That uncertainty made the fear even worse. Every unexplained death became suspicious. Every sudden illness produced rumours. Every rival became a potential murderer. You begin hearing stories from the older servants. A prince who allegedly died after drinking wine from a silver goblet. A noblewoman whose enemies supposedly bribed kitchen staff. A king who trusted the wrong advisor. The details change depending on who tells the story. Some tales are true, others grow larger with each retelling. Medieval gossip has never allowed facts to interfere with a good story. Yet beneath the exaggeration lies a simple truth. Power attracts enemies. The greater the power, the greater the fear. Soon you notice precautions everywhere. The kitchens are heavily supervised. Important ingredients are guarded. Cellars remain locked. Servants carrying dishes are watched carefully. Some nobles even bring trusted attendants to oversee the preparation of meals. And still nobody feels completely safe, because poison can be hidden in meat, wine, sauces, fruit, or medicine. It can travel through kitchens, servants, merchants, and guests. Most frightening of all, It can come from someone already sitting at the table, which is why when the next feast arrives, you once again find yourself standing before a plate of food. And this time you understand exactly why everyone is watching. By the third feast, you begin to understand that food tasting is not simply a job. It is a performance. The Lord is not the only person watching you. Every guest in the hall studies the ritual as it unfolds. Visiting nobles observe carefully. Ambassadors notice every detail. Even servants pause to glance toward the high table. The act of tasting sends a message. It tells everyone present that precautions are being taken. Whether those precautions are effective is another matter entirely. Before each meal, dishes arrive from the kitchens under close supervision. The steward checks them. Guards remain nearby. Senior servants inspect the presentation. Nothing reaches the Lord's table without passing through multiple pairs of eyes. Then comes your part. A slice of meat is cut. A piece of bread is broken off. A cup of wine is poured. You take the first bite, the first sip. Then everyone waits. At first, the waiting feels unbearable. You imagine every strange sensation is a symptom. A dry throat becomes alarming. A stomach rumble becomes terrifying. Even a simple cough can make nearby servants glance nervously in your direction. Most of the time, nothing happens. The food is perfectly safe, but the fear remains. Experienced food tasters develop routines to hide their anxiety. Some joke with kitchen staff. Others pretend complete confidence. A few become almost arrogant, treating the role as proof of their importance. You are not one of them. You have seen too many nervous looks exchanged behind closed doors. One evening, an elderly servant shares a truth that surprises you. Most poisoners are not geniuses. You expected stories about shadowy assassins and exotic toxins imported from distant lands. Instead, he explains that many alleged poisoning attempts are clumsy affairs. Poison must be obtained, transported, concealed, and administered without being noticed. Every step creates opportunities for failure. The kitchens themselves make secret poisoning difficult. Dozens of cooks, bakers, assistants, and servants work side by side. People talk. People notice unusual behaviour. People gossip constantly, and medieval servants are experts at gossip. A suspicious stranger near the kitchens becomes the topic of conversation within hours. A missing ingredient becomes tomorrow's rumour. A noble asking unusual questions quickly attracts attention. Yet despite these obstacles, the fear never disappears, because nobody knows which threat is real and which threat is imagined. Every feast becomes a test of trust. Every meal becomes a quiet gamble. And as you stand before another plate, surrounded by flickering candlelight and nervous glances, you begin to realize something unsettling. The Lord is not paying you because poison is common. He is paying you because even a tiny chance is enough to keep powerful men awake at night. Most people imagine a food tester spends every day standing beside kings, dramatically sampling goblets while suspicious nobles glare from across the room. The reality is considerably less exciting. Most days are spent waiting. When there is no feast, no diplomatic gathering, and no celebration, you remain an ordinary servant. You sweep floors, carry supplies, deliver messages, and assist wherever needed. The castle never runs out of work. In fact, the food tasting itself occupies only a small part of your life. Yet that small part changes everything. Other servants begin treating you differently. Some envy your position. After all, you regularly stand near the Lord himself. You hear conversations most common people never hear. You see important guests arrive from distant lands. You witness political negotiations, marriage discussions, and military planning. From a distance, it appears prestigious. Those same servants rarely mention that you are also the only person in the room expected to die first, if something goes wrong. The kitchen staff develop mixed feelings toward you as well. Some appreciate your role. A successful tasting reassures everyone that the meal is safe. Others find your presence annoying. Imagine spending 12 hours preparing an elaborate banquet, only to watch a nervous teenager poke suspiciously at every dish before it reaches the table. The cooks take pride in their work. You are essentially being paid to distrust it. One afternoon, the head cook pulls you aside. He is a massive man whose temper is nearly as famous as his roasted boar. "You know what I hate most about poison rumours?" he asks. You shake your head. "They make people think the kitchen is full of murderers." He gestures toward dozens of busy workers chopping vegetables, kneading dough, stirring pots, and hauling firewood. These people work harder than most nights. He is not entirely wrong. The kitchen rises before dawn and often works long after sunset. Burns, cuts, exhaustion, and smoke-filled air are constant companions. Most cooks are far more concerned with feeding hundreds of hungry mouths than plotting assassinations. Yet the suspicion remains. One strange illness can throw the entire castle into panic. One rumour can damage reputations. One unexpected death can spark investigations lasting months. The more time you spend at court, the more you realise something important. Poison is feared not because it is everywhere. It is feared because nobody can ever prove it is nowhere. And that uncertainty follows everyone. The lord, the cooks, the servants, even you. Especially you. Because while everyone else eventually leaves the table, you are always the first person asked to take a bite. As the months pass, you begin to notice a pattern. The people most afraid of poison are usually the people with the most power. The lord worries about ambitious rivals. The rival worries about ambitious relatives. The relatives worry about each other. It is a magnificent cycle of mutual suspicion. At times, it seems as though half the kingdom spends its days wondering who might secretly be trying to kill the other half. One autumn, a group of important guests arrives at the castle. Among them is a wealthy nobleman whose family has spent years competing with your lord for influence. Officially, the visit is friendly. Unofficially, nobody appears relaxed. The great hall fills with smiles. The smiles fool absolutely no one. The guests exchange compliments. They discuss hunting, trade, weather, and mutual prosperity. Meanwhile, servants whisper about old disputes, failed marriage negotiations, and arguments over land that stretch back decades. The tension hangs in the air like smoke. When dinner begins, something unusual happens. The visiting noble brings his own food taster. The sight causes immediate interest throughout the hall. Now there are two tasters, two sets of precautions. Two powerful men quietly demonstrating how little they trust the world around them. The ritual becomes almost theatrical. You sample your lord's food. The other taster samples his master's meal. Both sides watch carefully. Nothing happens. Everyone pretends this outcome is surprising. Afterward, an older court official explains the situation. Friendship is easy when nobody owns anything worth stealing. The remark stays with you. Many conflicts at court are not driven by hatred. They are driven by opportunity. A title, a castle, a trade route, a marriage alliance, an inheritance. Remove one powerful individual and suddenly someone else may gain all of those things. That possibility fuels endless suspicion. You soon learn that poison fears extend beyond banquets. Noble families worry about wine, medicine, spices, and even religious ceremonies. Some individuals become obsessive, refusing food from unfamiliar kitchens or demanding trusted servants handle every meal. A few develop reputations for near paranoia. One lord reportedly changed cups several times during dinner. Another insisted multiple servants sample his wine. A third allegedly trusted nobody except a childhood companion. Whether the stories are true hardly matters. People repeat them because they sound believable. And that is the heart of the problem. In a world without modern science, rumours often travel faster than facts. A single unexplained death can create years of suspicion. A single illness can destroy trust between allies. And every time another noble arrives at the castle, carrying gifts and friendly smiles, you find yourself wondering the same thing as everyone else. Is he truly a guest? Or is he simply an enemy who has not announced it yet? For nearly 2 years, nothing happens. You taste the food. The Lord eats the food. Everyone goes home alive. It is exactly the outcome everyone hopes for, and exactly the outcome nobody finds interesting. Human beings have always preferred dramatic stories to ordinary success. Nobody gathers around a fire to tell tales about the banquet where absolutely nothing occurred. But then one winter evening, something finally does. The trouble begins during a feast honouring several visiting merchants. The meal itself appears ordinary enough. Roasted goose, fresh bread, vegetables preserved from the autumn harvest, and several expensive wines purchased from foreign traders. You perform your usual duties. A bite of meat, a sip of wine, another sample from a sauce. Nothing seems unusual. The feast continues. Hours later, however, one of the merchants becomes violently ill. Conversation stops. Musicians fall silent. Servants rush through the hall. Within minutes, rumours begin spreading faster than the sickness itself. Poison. The word appears almost immediately. Not illness, not spoiled food, not bad wine, poison. By midnight, half the castle believes an assassination attempt has occurred. By morning, the story has grown even larger. Some claim foreign agents are responsible. Others blame rival merchants. A few insist the victim was targeted because of secret political dealings. One particularly imaginative guard somehow concludes that an entire neighbouring kingdom is involved. The reality proves much less exciting. After several days, it becomes clear that multiple guests ate the same food. Several experienced minor stomach problems. The merchant eventually recovers. The likely culprit? Spoiled ingredients. Not assassins, not spies, not international conspiracies. Just food that had gone bad. The revelation disappoints nearly everyone. A mysterious poison plot is far more entertaining than poorly stored provisions. Yet the incident teaches you something valuable. Fear often grows larger than facts. When powerful people expect danger, they begin seeing danger everywhere. An upset stomach becomes evidence. A headache becomes suspicion. A fever becomes a conspiracy. And because nobody possesses reliable medical knowledge, disproving those fears is difficult. The Lord's advisors still conduct inquiries. The kitchens are inspected. Servants are questioned. Merchants defend their reputations. Weeks pass before normality returns. Even then, some people remain unconvinced. Years later, certain individuals will still whisper that the merchant was poisoned. The evidence no longer matters. The story has become too good to abandon. As for you, the experience leaves a lasting impression. You realize that a food tester's greatest challenge is not always detecting poison. Sometimes it is surviving a world where everyone expects poison to be hiding around every corner. The longer you serve as a food tester, the more you discover that survival has its advantages. At first, you were simply another servant among dozens working in the castle. Most nobles barely noticed your existence. If you disappeared, someone else would quickly take your place. Now things are different. The Lord knows your name. That alone is enough to attract attention. You stand near the high table during feasts. You hear conversations that ordinary servants never hear. You witness political alliances being negotiated, marriage arrangements being discussed, and military campaigns being planned. You are not supposed to repeat any of it. Most food tasters quickly learn that keeping secrets is almost as important as tasting food. Trust becomes part of your value. The Lord is not merely trusting you with his meals. He is trusting you with access. That trust occasionally brings rewards. Your clothing improves. Your meals become better than those of most servants. You receive small payments, gifts, and privileges. During major celebrations, you may even dine on leftovers that would seem luxurious to your family back home. For a peasant's son, the change is remarkable. Yet the rewards come with complications. Other servants begin watching you more closely. Some admire your rise. Others resent it. Envy flourishes in every social class. One stable hand jokingly asks whether the Lord plans to leave you a castle in his will. Another servant remarks that you seem to spend more time with nobles than common people. The comments are meant as jokes. Mostly, you also discover that favour at court can disappear quickly. A noble's friendship today may become indifference tomorrow. A trusted servant can lose everything through one mistake. Court life is filled with examples of people who rose rapidly and fell even faster. The food tester occupies a strange position. You are important enough to be noticed, not important enough to be protected. If a lord dies despite every precaution, questions will follow, and some of those questions may lead directly to you. The realization keeps you humble. One evening, an elderly steward offers advice. The safest place at court, he says, is to be useful without becoming powerful. You think about those words often. Power attracts enemies. You have seen enough nobles to know that much. Perhaps your position is fortunate after all. You enjoy better food, better treatment, and greater opportunities than most servants. Yet every feast reminds you of the bargain. The Lord gains peace of mind. You gain a better life. And the price is simple. Before every important meal, someone places a plate before you and quietly asks the same question. Would you be willing to go first? By now, you have spent years tasting food for men who fear death. And yet the longer you serve, the more you realize that a food tester can only do so much. Many people imagine your role as a perfect shield against poison. It is not. The world is rarely that simple. One evening, while preparing for a royal banquet, a physician visiting the castle speaks with several servants. He seems amused by the confidence many nobles place in food tasters. You can test a meal, he says. You cannot test fate. The statement sounds dramatic, but there is truth in it. A food tester can sample food moments before it is served. A taster can discourage would-be poisoners. A taster can provide reassurance to nervous rulers. But poison is only one threat among many. Kings die from illness. Princes die from infections. Lords die from wounds suffered in battle. Some die from accidents. Others from age. A surprising number die because medieval medicine occasionally resembles a determined effort to make sick people even sicker. No food tester can prevent those things. The realization becomes clearer when a neighbouring noble dies unexpectedly. Rumours immediately spread through the region. Poison, people whisper. Poison always arrives first in the conversation. For weeks, stories circulate through castles, villages, and marketplaces. Some claim assassins infiltrated the household. Others blame political rivals. Eventually, travellers bring a less exciting explanation. The noble likely died from a sudden illness. The rumours continue anyway. People prefer mysteries. They prefer villains. They prefer hidden plots unfolding behind castle walls. The truth often struggles to compete. You begin noticing how frequently fear shapes behaviour. Nobles demand extra precautions. Guests inspect cups before drinking. Servants double-check dishes before carrying them into the hall. Everyone seeks certainty. Nobody finds it. Because certainty is rare in the medieval world. Every journey carries risk. Every winter brings disease. Every battlefield promises danger. Even the strongest king cannot control everything. One night, after another successful feast, you watch the lord laughing with his guests. For a few hours the fears seem distant. The candles glow, the wine flows, the musicians play. Yet tomorrow, those same men will return to worrying about rivals, plots, and hidden dangers. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson your job has taught you. Food tasting was never really about eliminating fear. It was about managing it, giving powerful people the comforting belief that someone, somewhere, was standing between them and the unknown. Years pass. The frightened boy who once stared nervously at a plate of venison has become a seasoned member of the household. You know every corridor of the castle. You know which cooks argue the most, which guards fall asleep during long watches, and which nobles smile too much when they are hiding something. Most importantly, you know that being a food tester was never quite what you imagined. When you first received the position, you believed your story would be about poison. Instead, it became a story about people. You have watched ambitious nobles compete for influence. You have seen merchants chase wealth, knights seek glory, and servants struggle for a better life. You have witnessed alliances formed over banquets and friendships destroyed over suspicion. Through it all, the food tasting ritual continues. The plate arrives, the sample is taken, the waiting begins. The lord eats, life moves forward. One evening, a young servant joins the household. He reminds you of yourself years earlier, nervous, eager, and completely unaware of how court life truly works. During a feast, he watches you perform your duties. Later, he approaches with a question. Are you ever afraid? The answer should be simple. Yet you pause, because the truth has changed over the years. When you were young, you feared poison itself. You imagined hidden assassins lurking behind every curtain. You worried that every strange taste might be your last. Now your fears are different. You fear false accusations. You fear political chaos. You fear the mistakes, misunderstandings, and rumours that have destroyed far more lives than poison ever did. The young servant listens carefully. Then he asks whether the job was worth it. You glance toward the great hall. The lord is speaking with guests. Musicians play softly. Servants move between tables carrying food and wine. The castle is alive. And despite all the fear, suspicion, and uncertainty, it has remained standing. Yes, you finally answer. Not because the work was easy, not because it was safe, but because it mattered. Food testers occupied a small place in the medieval world. Yet they served an important purpose. They provided reassurance in an age filled with uncertainty. They stood between rulers and one of their greatest fears, even when that protection was imperfect. History remembers kings, queens, and great battles. Few people remember the servants who tasted the food first. Yet countless royal meals began with an ordinary man taking a bite and waiting. And in a world obsessed with power, that quiet act of trust may have been one of the most remarkable jobs of all. By the summer of 323 BC, Alexander the Great had accomplished something that should have been impossible. At just 32 years old, he had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to Egypt. from the Mediterranean Sea to the distant frontiers of India. Entire kingdoms had fallen before him. Powerful rulers had surrendered. Cities had opened their gates at the mere rumour of his approach. For over a decade, Alexander seemed less like a man and more like a natural disaster that happened to wear armour. And then suddenly he got sick. That is what makes his death so fascinating. Alexander survived battles that should have killed him many times over. He led charges from the front. He fought hand-to-hand against experienced warriors. During one siege in India, he was struck by an arrow that pierced deep into his chest. His men believed he was dead, yet somehow he recovered. Again and again, fate appeared willing to make exceptions for him. But fate eventually became less cooperative. When Alexander entered Babylon in 323 BC, he stood at the height of his power. The ancient city was one of the richest places in the world. Vast palaces lined its streets. Merchants arrived from every corner of his empire. Ambassadors waited for audiences with the king who now ruled most of the known world. Alexander was not planning retirement. Far from it. He was already preparing new campaigns. Arabia was likely next. Some ancient writers even claimed he dreamed of pushing farther west and expanding his empire beyond anything previously imagined. The conqueror's appetite seemed limitless. His generals, however, were exhausted. Many had spent years marching through deserts, mountains, and hostile territories. They had crossed rivers, fought countless battles, and travelled farther than most people of the ancient world could even imagine. Alexander simply kept finding new places to conquer. In Babylon, celebrations were common. Banquets filled the royal palaces. Officers gathered to discuss future plans. Wine flowed freely, as it often did among Macedonian nobles. No one present had any reason to believe they were witnessing the final days of Alexander's life. Why would they? He was young. He was victorious. He had survived everything. If you had asked anyone in Babylon to predict how Alexander would die, they probably would have guessed a battlefield, an assassination, or perhaps some dramatic last stand worthy of legend. Almost nobody would have guessed a fever. Yet within weeks, the most powerful man on earth would be dead, and more than 2,000 years later, historians are still arguing about exactly why. The mystery begins with a dinner. Naturally it does. History's most famous unsolved deaths rarely begin with paperwork or an early bedtime. They usually begin with a feast, a cup of wine, and several witnesses who later disagree about everything. Alexander's final days unfolded inside the royal palaces of Babylon. The city buzzed with activity. Military officers discussed future campaigns. Administrators managed the enormous empire. Messengers travelled constantly between distant provinces. Alexander himself appeared focused on the future. He was organising expeditions, reviewing troops, making plans. There was little indication that death was waiting just around the corner. According to several ancient accounts, the turning point came during a banquet attended by friends and companions. One of the most frequently mentioned hosts was Medius of Larissa, a member of Alexander's inner circle. The gathering was not unusual. Macedonian nobles enjoyed drinking. That description may actually be too gentle. These men approached wine with the enthusiasm of people actively competing against their own liver. Heavy drinking was common at royal celebrations. Toasts followed victories. Toasts followed meetings. Toasts followed other toasts. A modern physician observing one of these banquets would probably spend most of the evening quietly having a nervous breakdown. Ancient sources describe Alexander drinking heavily during the gathering. Then something happened. The details vary. Some accounts claim he suddenly felt sharp pain after consuming a large cup of wine. Others suggest the illness developed more gradually. Ancient historians writing years later preserved different versions of the story, ensuring that future generations would inherit a mystery rather than a clear answer. What everyone agrees on is this: Alexander became sick. Very sick. At first, the illness may not have seemed alarming. Powerful rulers got sick all the time. Most recovered. Alexander himself had survived serious illnesses before, but this time was different. The fever continued. Day after day his condition worsened. Despite growing weakness, he reportedly continued discussing military matters. He met officers, issued instructions, reviewed plans. The conqueror seemed determined to act as though nothing was wrong. Unfortunately, fevers are famously uninterested in royal authority. As the days passed, Alexander struggled more and more. Eventually he could no longer command as before. His generals gathered around him. His soldiers waited anxiously outside the palace. Rumors spread throughout Babylon. The king who had conquered Persia, Egypt, and lands beyond the edge of the Greek world was now fighting an enemy he could not charge with a cavalry attack. And unlike every battlefield opponent he had faced before, this enemy was invisible. As Alexander's condition worsened, the mood in Babylon began to change. The city that had recently celebrated the future of a vast empire now found itself wondering whether that future was about to disappear. At first there was hope. After all, Alexander had survived worse. Years earlier, during his campaigns, he had suffered severe wounds and dangerous illnesses. In one famous incident, he became gravely sick after bathing in the cold waters of the Cydnus River. Many feared he would die. Instead, he recovered. That was what Alexander did. He recovered again and again. His companions had grown accustomed to seeing him cheat death. This time, however, the pattern failed. The fever continued. Ancient accounts suggest the illness lasted roughly 10 to 12 days. During that time, Alexander became progressively weaker. The fever remained stubborn. His strength faded. Simple tasks became increasingly difficult. Yet his mind appears to have remained largely intact. This detail would later become very important. Many poison theories rely on the assumption that Alexander's symptoms appeared suddenly and dramatically, but several ancient descriptions portray something different. A prolonged illness that slowly drained him over many days. That sounds less like a theatrical assassination and more like a genuine disease. Still, nothing about the situation felt ordinary. As word spread through the palace, anxiety grew among the generals. These men had followed Alexander across thousands of miles. They had fought beside him in some of history's most famous battles. They had helped build an empire stretching across 3 continents. Now they faced a terrifying question. What happens if Alexander dies? The answer was simple. Nobody knew. Alexander had no clear adult heir. His empire was enormous. His generals were ambitious, and every powerful man in Babylon understood exactly how much was at stake. Meanwhile, outside the palace, ordinary soldiers gathered in growing numbers. Many refused to believe the rumors. Others feared the worst. Ancient writers describe soldiers demanding to see their king. They wanted proof that he was still alive. Eventually, Alexander was reportedly carried before them, too weak to speak, too weak to stand, yet still conscious. As his soldiers filed past, he acknowledged them with small gestures. It was a heartbreaking scene. The man who had once led cavalry charges at full speed could barely raise a hand. The conqueror of the Persian Empire had become a patient trapped in his own bed, and with every passing day, the mystery deepened, because nobody could explain why this was happening. Not the physicians, not the generals, not the priests. The fever kept burning. The king kept weakening, and somewhere inside the palace of Babylon, the fate of the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen hung on whether one very sick man could somehow recover one more time. Whenever a famous ruler dies unexpectedly, somebody eventually asks the same question. What if it wasn't an accident? In Alexander's case, people began asking that question almost immediately. The idea of poisoning has fascinated historians for more than 2,000 years. It is easy to understand why. A conqueror survives countless battles, defeats mighty empires, and then suddenly dies in a palace at the age of 32. It sounds suspicious, almost too suspicious. And perhaps nobody had more potential enemies than Alexander. By 323 BC, he ruled an empire so vast that countless people stood to benefit from his death. Rival nobles, resentful generals, foreign enemies, displaced Persian elites, and even members of his own inner circle all possessed possible motives. The list is long, very long. Alexander's success had created enormous opportunities. His death would create even more. Some ancient writers pointed fingers at Antipater, the powerful governor of Macedonia. Others suspected Antipater's sons. A few theories even dragged Aristotle into the story because of his connection to Antipater's family. Poor Aristotle has spent centuries being accused of many things. Murdering Alexander is perhaps the most ambitious accusation on his resume. According to some later accounts, poison was secretly transported to Babylon and administered during the fatal banquet. Certain versions claim the poison was hidden in wine. Others suggest a more elaborate conspiracy involving multiple participants. The stories become increasingly dramatic with each retelling. There is only one problem. Most historians are skeptical, very skeptical. The symptoms described in ancient sources simply do not fit most known poisons available in the ancient world. Alexander's illness lasted many days. He developed a persistent fever. His condition gradually worsened. Many poisons act much faster. Others produce symptoms that ancient writers never mention. More importantly, if Alexander had been poisoned, the conspirators would have needed extraordinary luck. They would have had to infiltrate one of the most heavily guarded courts on Earth, target the most powerful man alive, and somehow leave almost no reliable evidence behind. That is not impossible. It is just difficult. Extremely difficult. Yet the poison theory refuses to disappear, partly because it is exciting, partly because human beings love conspiracies, and partly because the political situation after Alexander's death looked suspiciously convenient for certain people. Within months, his generals began dividing power. Within years, they were fighting wars against one another. The empire Alexander built started breaking apart. Looking backward, it is tempting to imagine a carefully planned plot, but historians must be careful. A convenient outcome does not automatically prove a conspiracy. Still, as Alexander lay dying in Babylon, surrounded by ambitious men who stood to gain everything from his death, the suspicion was impossible to ignore. And it remains impossible to ignore today. If poison remains the most dramatic explanation for Alexander's death, alcohol may be the most believable, at least at first glance. Alexander's relationship with drinking was complicated. Like many Macedonian nobles, he drank heavily. Banquets were an important part of court life. Victories were celebrated with wine. Alliances were strengthened with wine. Grievances were sometimes expressed with wine, and occasionally solved with more wine. Ancient Macedonian drinking culture was not known for moderation. Guests often consumed enormous quantities during feasts, especially when trying to impress one another. Alexander was no exception. Throughout his life, several incidents suggested that alcohol sometimes clouded his judgment. One of the most famous occurred years earlier, when, during a drunken argument, he killed his close friend Clytus the Black. The event haunted him afterward. Yet it also demonstrated how excessive drinking had become woven into the culture surrounding his court. This history naturally raises a question. Could alcohol itself have killed Alexander? Some ancient accounts describe him consuming a large quantity of wine shortly before falling ill. Certain versions even claim he experienced sudden pain immediately after drinking. To modern readers, that sounds significant. However, historians and medical experts generally doubt that alcohol alone was responsible. Heavy drinking can certainly damage the body. It can weaken the immune system, stress vital organs, and contribute to numerous health problems. But alcohol by itself rarely causes a healthy 32-year-old man to develop a prolonged fever lasting many days. The fever remains the problem. Again and again, researchers return to the same obstacle. Alexander did not simply collapse from drinking too much wine. He became progressively ill. His symptoms unfolded over more than a week. Something else appears to have been happening. That does not mean alcohol was irrelevant. Far from it. Years of heavy drinking may have left Alexander physically weakened. Constant military campaigns, wounds, exhaustion, irregular sleep, harsh climates, and enormous stress had already placed tremendous strain on his body. By the time he reached Babylon, Alexander may have looked invincible from the outside while carrying hidden vulnerabilities within. The image is almost ironic. For years, enemies had failed to destroy him. Persian armies had failed. Indian warriors had failed. Assassins had failed. Yet the lifestyle of constant warfare, endless travel, and relentless celebration may have slowly worn him down. If that is true, alcohol was not the killer. It was merely one contributor among many. One more burden placed upon a body that had already endured more punishment than most men experience in several lifetimes. And if alcohol cannot fully explain Alexander's death, historians must turn to another possibility. Perhaps the conqueror was defeated not by poison or wine, but by something far more ordinary. A disease. The farther historians move away from poison and alcohol, the more they arrive at an explanation that is far less exciting, and probably far more likely. Disease. It lacks the drama of secret assassins. It lacks the intrigue of political conspiracies. Nobody writes thrilling novels about a conqueror being defeated by bacteria. Yet disease has one major advantage over the other theories. It actually fits the evidence. Babylon in 323 BC was not exactly a model of modern sanitation. The city sat amid canals, rivers, marshes, and stagnant water. During the hot summer months, disease spread easily. Mosquitoes thrived. Water contamination was common. Infections were everywhere. To ancient people, illness often appeared without warning and vanished without explanation. To modern researchers, Babylon looks like the perfect environment for numerous deadly diseases. One possibility is malaria. The symptoms match surprisingly well: high fever, weakness, exhaustion, and a gradual decline over many days, all fit known forms of the disease. Babylon's surrounding wetlands would have provided an ideal habitat for the mosquitoes that spread it. Another possibility is typhoid fever. This theory has gained considerable support among some scholars. Typhoid can produce prolonged fever, severe weakness, abdominal symptoms, and a slow deterioration remarkably similar to what ancient sources describe. Unlike poison theories, typhoid does not require secret plots. It merely requires contaminated food or water. Unfortunately, ancient cities provided plenty of both. Other researchers have suggested diseases such as West Nile fever, pneumonia, or various infections that can no longer be identified with certainty. The problem is obvious. No medical records survive. No body remains available for examination. Everything depends on ancient descriptions written by authors who were not doctors, and who sometimes disagreed with one another. It is a little like trying to solve a murder mystery after someone has burned most of the evidence and scattered the remaining pieces across 2,000 years. Still, the disease theory explains several crucial details: the prolonged fever, the gradual worsening, the fact that Alexander remained conscious for much of the illness, the absence of dramatic symptoms associated with many poisons. Most importantly, disease explains something historians sometimes forget. Alexander was human. History often portrays him as a larger-than-life figure, a conqueror, a military genius, a man who seemed unstoppable. But disease does not care about military genius. It does not care about empires. It does not care how many battles you have won. A microscopic organism can accomplish what entire armies cannot. And if that is what happened in Babylon, then Alexander the Great may have met the same fate as countless ordinary people whose names history never bothered to record. If Alexander's life created legends, his death created even more. And perhaps the strangest legend of all began after he was already dead. According to several ancient accounts, Alexander's body did something remarkable. It refused to decay. For days after his death, observers reportedly noted that his corpse showed little or no visible signs of decomposition. In the scorching heat of Babylon, where bodies normally deteriorated quickly, this seemed extraordinary. To many of his followers, it appeared to be proof of something they already wanted to believe. Alexander was not merely a king, he was divine, or at least partly divine. Throughout his life, Alexander had encouraged associations between himself and the gods. In Egypt, he had visited the oracle of Ammon, where he was linked to divine ancestry. Across his empire, stories circulated portraying him as more than an ordinary man. A body untouched by decay seemed like powerful evidence. The legend spread, and the myth grew. Yet modern scholars approached the story with caution. Ancient writers loved dramatic details. They understood that remarkable events made memorable stories. A conqueror whose corpse remained untouched by decay sounds far more impressive than a conqueror whose body behaved normally. Still, some researchers have proposed interesting explanations. One possibility is that Alexander was not actually dead when people first believed he was. That idea sounds shocking, but it is based on a real medical phenomenon. Certain illnesses can cause extreme weakness, shallow breathing, and near-complete paralysis. In rare cases, a person may appear dead while still technically alive. Without modern medical equipment, distinguishing between life and death could be surprisingly difficult. A few modern theories suggest Alexander may have suffered from a neurological disorder, such as Guillain-Barré syndrome, which can gradually paralyze the body while leaving the mind aware. If such a condition occurred, observers might have mistaken profound paralysis for death. It is an unsettling possibility. Imagine the greatest conqueror in history unable to move, unable to speak, fully conscious while those around him believed he was already gone. Most historians remain skeptical. The evidence is simply too limited. But the theory demonstrates how mysterious Alexander's final days remain. Even after centuries of study, scholars continue proposing new explanations. Meanwhile, Alexander's body became almost as important as his empire, because once he was truly dead, another question emerged. Who would inherit his kingdom? The answer, as it turned out, was nobody, at least not peacefully, and the struggle that followed would plunge Alexander's empire into decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and war. Alexander's death created a problem almost as extraordinary as his life. He had conquered the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, but he had failed to solve one simple question. Who comes next? As the fever finally claimed him in Babylon, his generals gathered around the dying king. According to ancient accounts, someone asked who should inherit the empire. The answer Alexander supposedly gave became legendary: to the strongest. Whether he actually said those words remains uncertain. The consequences, however, were very real. Alexander left behind no clear adult successor. His half-brother, Aridaeus, suffered from mental and physical limitations that made independent rule difficult. Meanwhile, Alexander's wife Roxana was pregnant, but her child had not yet been born. The greatest empire on earth suddenly had no obvious ruler. It was a disaster waiting to happen. At first, Alexander's generals attempted cooperation, at least officially. Meetings were held. Agreements were drafted. Positions were assigned. The empire was divided into administrative regions governed by trusted commanders. On paper, everything appeared orderly. In reality, everyone understood what was coming. These men had spent years helping Alexander conquer kingdoms. They commanded armies. They controlled provinces. They possessed enormous ambition. And now the one man capable of keeping them united was gone. The tension grew quickly. Each general claimed to be protecting Alexander's legacy. Conveniently, protecting Alexander's legacy often seemed to involve gaining more power for himself. The arrangement began unraveling almost immediately. Arguments became rivalries. Rivalries became conflicts. Conflicts became wars. Historians call them the wars of the successors. The participants called them opportunities. Over the following decades, Alexander's former companions fought relentlessly against one another. Alliances shifted constantly. Friendships dissolved. Betrayals multiplied. Men who had once marched together across Asia now sent armies against each other. The irony was difficult to miss. Alexander had conquered vast territories through military brilliance. His successors spent years tearing those conquests apart. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing is that nobody truly replaced him. Some inherited pieces of his empire. None inherited all of it. The empire eventually fractured into powerful kingdoms, ruled by former generals and their descendants. Egypt fell under Ptolemy. Large portions of Asia came under Seleucus. Others carved out territories of their own. Alexander's empire survived. Alexander's empire also died. And as the wars spread across the ancient world, people increasingly looked back toward Babylon and asked the same haunting question. If Alexander had lived just a few more years, would any of this have happened at all? More than 2,000 years have passed since Alexander died in Babylon, and despite centuries of debate, historians still cannot agree on exactly what killed him. That alone says something remarkable. Most ancient deaths disappear into history without much discussion. Alexander's death remains different because the circumstances were unusual, the consequences were enormous, and the evidence is frustratingly incomplete. Every theory has strengths. Every theory has problems. The poison theory remains the most dramatic. It has everything people love: ambitious rivals, secret plots, suspicious timing, and powerful men who benefited from Alexander's death. It feels like the ending of a great political thriller. Unfortunately, history does not award points for being entertaining. Most modern historians find the poison theory difficult to support. The illness lasted too long. The symptoms do not neatly match known poisons of the era. The evidence largely comes from later sources written long after the events themselves. Could Alexander have been poisoned? Possibly. Can it be proven? Not even close. Then there is alcohol. Alexander certainly drank heavily. Ancient sources leave little doubt about that. Years of campaigning, stress, injuries, and excessive drinking may have weakened his body. Yet alcohol alone struggles to explain the prolonged fever that appears in multiple accounts. It may have contributed. It probably did not act alone. That leaves disease. Not the most exciting answer, but often the most convincing. A fever that gradually worsens over 10 days fits numerous infectious diseases far better than it fits assassination. Babylon's environment was ideal for illness. Alexander's body had endured years of hardship, wounds, exhaustion, and exposure to unfamiliar climates. The conqueror may simply have encountered a disease that his body could no longer overcome. In many ways, that explanation feels almost unfair. History's greatest military genius survives battles, sieges, mutinies, assassination attempts, deserts, mountains, and countless enemies. Then a microscopic organism ends the story. No grand final battle, no glorious last charge, just a fever. Yet perhaps that is precisely why the mystery endures. Alexander spent his life appearing larger than life itself. He conquered kingdoms so quickly that many contemporaries believed destiny favoured him. Some even considered him divine. His death reminds us of something uncomfortable. Even the most extraordinary individuals remain human. Kings become sick. Empires collapse. Legends do, and sometimes the greatest mystery in history is not how a man conquered the world. It is how, after conquering so much, he could still be defeated by something as ordinary as death. That is why historians continue arguing about Alexander's final days, because the mystery is really about more than his death. It is about the limits of power itself. For most of the year, life among the Germanic tribes is hard work. There are fields to plant, livestock to manage, roofs to repair, tools to maintain, and enough daily problems to remind everyone that nature is rarely interested in human convenience. Winter is especially unforgiving. The days are short, the nights seem endless. Food stores shrink, travel becomes difficult. Entire communities spend months waiting for the return of warmth and light, which is why midsummer feels almost magical. The longest days of the year arrive gradually. At first, nobody notices. Then the sun begins rising earlier. The evenings stretch longer. Darkness retreats a little more each week. Before long, it seems as though the sun has forgotten how to leave. In the northern lands inhabited by many Germanic peoples, daylight lingers deep into the evening. The forests glow beneath golden light. Birds continue singing long after they should have gone quiet. Children remain outdoors until their exhausted parents finally force them home. For a brief period, the world feels abundant. The crops are growing, the cattle are healthy, the sheep are fat, the rivers are full, and most importantly, winter feels very far away. The Germanic tribes do not view this as a coincidence. To them, nature is alive with meaning. The changing seasons reflect the power of gods and unseen forces. Every successful harvest, every healthy animal, and every warm summer day depends upon maintaining a proper relationship with the divine. Midsummer therefore becomes more than a celebration. It becomes a moment of gratitude. Across forests, valleys, and open plains, preparations begin weeks in advance. Villages discuss gathering places. Families save food for upcoming feasts. Brewers prepare large quantities of ale. Hunters seek fresh game. Farmers look forward to a rare opportunity to rest and celebrate. For many people, this will be the largest gathering of the entire year. Relatives who have not seen one another for months will reunite. Friendships will be renewed. Marriages may be arranged. Old disputes might even be settled, though not always successfully. Human beings have somehow managed to combine alcohol and arguments for thousands of years with remarkably consistent results. Yet most arrive in good spirits. As the longest day approaches, excitement spreads through the settlements. Everyone knows what is coming. The sacred fires, the feasting, the dancing, the ceremonies, the celebration of light itself. For a few precious days, the hardships of ordinary life can wait. The sun is high. The fields are green. And all across the Germanic world, people are preparing for the most joyful festival of the year. As the longest day approaches, the excitement begins long before the festival itself. For many Germanic families, the celebration is not a single evening. It is an event that takes weeks to prepare. Across the countryside, people begin making plans. Small farms and isolated homesteads that spend much of the year focused on survival suddenly turn their attention towards something far more enjoyable. A party. A very large party. And unlike modern gatherings, where someone forgets to bring enough drinks and stops at a nearby store, every detail must be arranged in advance. Food needs to be collected. Ale must be brewed. Animals must be selected. Travel routes have to be planned. The preparations become a community effort. Women spend days baking bread, preserving food, and organising supplies for the journey. Men repair wagons, sharpen tools, and prepare livestock. Children help where they can, though they mostly contribute enthusiasm and a remarkable ability to get underfoot at critical moments. As always, they are carrying on a tradition older than history itself. The gathering places vary from tribe to tribe. Some meet in open fields, others gather near sacred groves. Certain festivals take place beside rivers, lakes, or ancient sites associated with local gods and ancestors. Whatever the location, people begin arriving days before the ceremonies start. The roads and forest paths become busy. Families travel on foot, horseback, or by wagon. Friends who have not seen one another since the previous festival greet each other warmly. Traders arrive hoping to exchange goods. Storytellers, craftsmen, and wandering travellers appear from distant settlements. Temporary camps soon spread across the landscape. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Animals graze nearby. Children race through the camps while adults exchange news and gossip. And there is always plenty of gossip. Who got married? Who had a child? Who lost a cow? Who gained a cow? Who claims his neighbour stole the cow? For people living in scattered communities, these gatherings serve as an important social network long before anyone invents such a phrase. News spreads quickly. So do rumours. One evening around a campfire, a traveller may tell stories about distant tribes, Roman merchants, strange weather, or unusual events far beyond the local region. Some stories are undoubtedly true. Others become significantly more impressive after several cups of ale. As more people arrive, the excitement builds. The camps grow larger. The laughter grows louder. The scent of roasting meat fills the air. Everyone knows that the sacred ceremonies are still to come. But already the festival has begun. Because for the Germanic tribes, midsummer is not merely about honouring the gods. It is also about bringing people together beneath the longest days of the year. As the camps grow larger and the festival gains momentum, attention gradually turns toward the most important part of the gathering, the sacred places. To the Germanic tribes, religion is not confined to temples built from stone. In fact, many tribes do not build grand temples at all. The natural world itself serves as a sanctuary. Ancient forests, towering oak trees, quiet springs, mist-covered lakes, open meadows untouched by farming. These are the places where the gods feel closest. And during midsummer, entire communities gather to honour them. At the centre of many festivals stands a sacred grove. Such groves are often centuries old. Massive trees stretch high into the sky, their branches forming a natural roof over the earth below. Few people enter these places casually. They are treated with respect, sometimes with fear. Ancient writers who encountered Germanic peoples described sacred forests where important ceremonies occurred and where certain areas remained untouched by ordinary activity. To cut down a sacred tree without permission would be unthinkable. At best, it would make your neighbours furious. At worst, it might make the gods furious. And most people consider the second possibility considerably more dangerous. As the festival approaches, tribal leaders, priests, and respected elders prepare the ceremonial grounds. Paths are cleared, offerings are organised, sacred objects may be brought out for public rituals. The atmosphere begins to change. The noisy excitement of the camps gives way to something more solemn. People lower their voices. Children are reminded to behave. Even the warriors, who usually solve problems by seeing how loudly they can shout, become more respectful for a while. The ceremonies themselves vary from tribe to tribe. Germanic religion is not a single unified system. Different communities honour different gods and local traditions. Some may offer prayers to gods associated with fertility and good harvests. Others seek protection for their families and livestock. Many give thanks for surviving another year and ask for prosperity in the months ahead. The offerings are often simple. Food, drink, animals, crafted goods, things that possess genuine value. After all, a sacrifice means little if it costs nothing. Standing among the ancient trees, surrounded by hundreds of people gathered beneath the bright summer sky, it becomes easy to understand why these places inspire such reverence. The forest feels older than memory itself. The traditions feel older still. And as preparations near completion, everyone knows that the most spectacular moment of the festival is about to arrive. Soon the sacred fires will be lit, and the night will glow brighter than the day. As sunset approaches, the entire festival begins moving toward its most anticipated moment. The lighting of the sacred fires. For days, people have been arriving. They have feasted, traded, prayed, and reunited with family members. Yet everyone knows the true heart of the celebration is still ahead. The bonfires. Huge piles of wood have already been prepared. Young men spent days gathering logs from nearby forests. Branches have been stacked carefully. The largest fires stand taller than several men. They dominate the landscape. Even before they are lit, they command attention. As evening arrives, crowds gather around the prepared sites. Families stand together. Warriors mingle with farmers. Elders settle into places of honor. Children push forward for a better view until their parents pull them back again. Some things never change. A deep sense of anticipation spreads through the crowd. The daylight still lingers. This is, after all, the longest day of the year. The sun seems reluctant to leave. Eventually, ceremonial leaders step forward. Prayers are spoken. Offerings are made. Voices rise toward the sky. Then the first flame appears. At first it is small, almost unimpressive. A single spark dancing against the growing darkness. Then the fire catches. The dry wood crackles. Flames begin climbing upward. Within moments, the entire structure erupts into brilliant light. The crowd cheers. More fires follow. One after another, great bonfires ignite across the gathering grounds. The effect is breathtaking. Golden flames roar into the night sky. Sparks drift upward like swarms of glowing stars. Thick smoke rises above the treetops. Faces flicker in the firelight. For the Germanic tribes, these fires are far more than decoration. Fire represents protection, purification, life, the strength of the sun itself. Many believe the flames possess special power during midsummer. Some walk around the fires for good fortune. Others carry burning torches back to their homes, believing the sacred flame will bring blessings and protection during the coming year. Certain communities even drive livestock near the fires or between smaller bonfires. The animals probably have mixed feelings about this tradition. The people, however, believe it helps safeguard the herds from illness and misfortune. As darkness finally settles over the land, the fires become visible for miles. Across hills and forests, they burn like giant beacons. The longest day has reached its peak. The sun may be setting, but the light remains, and as music begins to echo through the gathering grounds, the celebration enters its most joyful phase. The dancing is about to begin. Once the sacred fires are burning, the mood begins to change. The solemn ceremonies are over. Now comes the celebration. Music spreads through the gathering grounds. Drums beat steadily. Simple flutes and horns join in. Hands clap to the rhythm. Voices rise together in songs that many have known since childhood. Soon people begin to dance. At first, only a few step forward. Then more follow. Before long, entire circles form around the bonfires. Young and old alike join the movement. Men link arms. Women dance beside family and friends. Children weave through the crowd, trying to imitate the adults while inventing their own versions of the steps. Some succeed, some do not. Fortunately, the increasing amount of ale being consumed makes everyone considerably less concerned about dancing skill. The fires cast long shadows across the ground. Sparks drift overhead. The music grows louder as confidence grows stronger. For many attendees, this is one of the rare opportunities to celebrate without worrying about work. The fields can wait. The livestock can wait. The endless repairs that somehow appear every week can certainly wait. Tonight belongs to joy. The dancing serves another purpose as well. Midsummer is one of the most important social gatherings of the year. Young people who live far apart finally have a chance to meet. Friendships form. Courtships begin. Future marriages sometimes start with a conversation beside a fire, or with an awkward attempt at dancing. History suggests both methods have enjoyed mixed success. Parents watch carefully from the edges of the crowd. Some approve of potential matches. Others begin immediately searching for reasons to disapprove. This tradition, too, appears remarkably ancient. As the night progresses, the dancing becomes more energetic. Larger circles form around the fires. Storytellers entertain groups gathered nearby. Musicians compete to keep the crowd moving. The atmosphere is unlike anything experienced during ordinary village life. For a brief time, tribal divisions seem less important. Farmers dance with warriors. Travellers share songs with strangers. Families from distant settlements celebrate together. The entire gathering becomes a living reminder that they belong to something larger than their individual households. And perhaps that is part of the festival's true purpose. Not merely honouring the gods, not merely celebrating the sun, but strengthening the bonds that hold the community together. As midnight approaches, the fires continue blazing against the darkness. The music carries across the fields. The laughter grows louder, And nobody seems particularly interested in sleeping. After all, the shortest night of the year comes only once. Eventually, even the most enthusiastic dancers need food. Fortunately, the Germanic tribes have planned for this possibility extensively. Midsummer feasts are among the largest meals many people will enjoy all year. Months of preparation have gone into ensuring that enough food exists to feed hundreds, sometimes thousands of attendees. The timing is perfect. The harsh months of winter are long gone. Fresh resources are becoming available again. Livestock are healthy. Game is plentiful. Fishing has been productive. Food stores remain reasonably full. For a brief moment, nature is being unusually cooperative. The feast begins around the great fires. Long wooden tables are covered with food. In many places, there are not enough tables at all, and people simply gather in large groups around cooking areas. No one seems particularly bothered. The food itself varies from tribe to tribe, but certain staples appear everywhere. Roasted pork, beef, mutton, fresh bread, cheese, fish from nearby rivers and lakes, wild berries gathered from forests, honey used to sweeten dishes and drinks. The smell alone is enough to make travellers hungry from several villages away. Large spits turn slowly over open flames. Fat crackles as meat roasts. Cooks move constantly between fires, trying to keep up with demand. Meanwhile, barrels of ale and mead begin disappearing at an impressive rate. A truly impressive rate. One might even call it historically concerning. Fortunately, most participants consider this a feature rather than a problem. Drinking occupies an important role during the celebration. Toasts are offered to the gods, ancestors, tribal leaders, successful harvests, and occasionally to things that become increasingly difficult to identify as the evening progresses. As food and drink circulate, conversation flows freely. Stories are exchanged. Old adventures become slightly more heroic with each retelling. Hunting trips become more dangerous. Enemies become more numerous. Fish become substantially larger. The fish, in particular, appear to benefit greatly from the passing of time. The feast also serves an important social purpose. Disputes can be settled. Agreements can be made. Trade arrangements are discussed. Families strengthen relationships through shared meals. In a world where survival often depends upon cooperation, eating together reinforces the bonds that keep communities functioning. As the hours pass, the atmosphere becomes warmer and more relaxed. The sacred fires continue burning. The music drifts through the night. Laughter echoes across the gathering grounds. For a few precious hours, worries about winter work and hardship seem distant. The tribe has food, the tribe has light, and the tribe has each other. By the time the feasting reaches its height, another tradition begins to emerge. Competition. After all, gathering hundreds of Germanic tribesmen in one place, feeding them enormous quantities of roasted meat and ale, and then expecting them to quietly sit around discussing philosophy would be wildly unrealistic. Someone is eventually going to suggest a contest, usually several. The first competitions are often simple displays of strength. Large stones are lifted, heavy logs are carried, young warriors challenge one another to wrestling matches. Crowds quickly form around the competitors. Cheers erupt whenever someone accomplishes an impressive feat. Friendly insults fly freely between rival villages, mostly friendly. Most of the time, wrestling is especially popular. Two opponents step into a cleared space while spectators form a circle around them. Victory comes through skill, strength, and balance rather than serious injury. The goal is to prove yourself, not to accidentally eliminate a future trading partner, though some participants occasionally require reminders of this principle. Elsewhere, contests of speed and endurance take place. Young men race across fields. Hunters compare their archery skills. Spear-throwing competitions attract large crowds. Every successful throw earns admiration. Every unsuccessful throw earns laughter. Germanic audiences appear to have possessed a healthy appreciation for both outcomes. The competitions are not limited to warriors. Storytelling contests occur around campfires. Skilled musicians perform for gathered audiences. Poets and singers compete to entertain listeners with tales of heroes, gods, and legendary ancestors. In a culture where history is often passed down orally, a talented storyteller can earn almost as much respect as a talented fighter, sometimes more. After all, not everyone can defeat an enemy in battle, but everyone enjoys a good story. The games also provide an opportunity for young people to build reputations. A strong performance in front of the assembled tribes can attract attention from leaders, potential allies, and even prospective marriage partners. Suddenly, lifting that large stone becomes slightly more important. As the day continues, victories are celebrated, and defeats are endured with varying degrees of dignity. Some competitors accept defeat gracefully. Others immediately begin explaining how they would have won, if not for the sun, the ground, their sandals, or some other conveniently available excuse. Human nature remains wonderfully consistent. Yet beneath the laughter and rivalry lies something deeper. These competitions strengthen the community. They reward skill. They encourage excellence. And they allow people from distant settlements to test themselves against one another without drawing swords, which is generally considered an improvement. As evening approaches once again, attention begins turning back toward the sacred fires, because the most spiritual part of the festival is still ahead. As the competitions wind down and the excitement begins to settle, the festival turns once more toward the sacred. The fires are still burning, the stars are beginning to appear overhead, and now comes the moment when many participants reflect on why they gathered in the first place. For the Germanic tribes, midsummer is not simply a celebration of good weather and full stomachs. It is a sacred occasion, a time to honor the powers believed to govern the world around them. Throughout the gathering grounds, people approach the holy places prepared earlier. Some carry food, others bring crafted objects, valuable tools, jewelry, or portions of their harvest. These offerings represent gratitude and hope. A farmer may ask for healthy crops, a shepherd may pray for strong livestock, a warrior may seek protection in future battles, parents may ask for the safety of their children. In a world filled with uncertainty, divine favor is considered a valuable thing to possess. The ceremonies vary from tribe to tribe. Germanic religion is diverse, and local customs differ greatly. Some communities focus on gods associated with fertility and prosperity. Others honor gods connected to war, wisdom, or protection. Many also remember their ancestors. This is an important part of the festival. The dead are not forgotten. Families speak the names of relatives who have passed away. Stories are shared around the fires. Elders recount the deeds of parents, grandparents, and heroes from generations past. For a brief moment, it feels as though the living and the dead are participating in the same celebration. The ancestors remain part of the community, just unseen. As darkness deepens, the atmosphere becomes quieter. The loud laughter from earlier gives way to reflection. People watch the flames dance against the night sky. Some sit silently. Others pray. Children listen to stories they have heard many times before but never seem to tire of. The fires crackle steadily. The forest surrounds the gathering. The stars shine overhead. In moments like these, it is easy to understand why such festivals remained important for centuries. They provide more than entertainment. They provide meaning. They connect people to their gods, their families, their traditions, and their history. And perhaps most importantly, they remind everyone that they are part of something larger than themselves. As the sacred rituals conclude, the fires continue to burn through the night. But dawn is approaching, and with it comes the final chapter of the midsummer celebration. Eventually, even the longest day must end. The fires that blaze through the night begin to shrink. The music grows quieter. The laughter becomes less frequent. One by one, exhausted festival goers drift toward their camps or settle beside the fading embers. For many, sleep comes only briefly, because dawn itself is part of the celebration. As the eastern horizon begins to brighten, people gather once more to witness the rising sun. The moment carries deep symbolism. Midsummer marks the peak of the sun's power, the longest day of the year, but it also marks a turning point. From this day forward, however gradually, the daylight will begin to shorten. The sun has reached its highest point. Now its long journey toward winter begins. The Germanic tribes understand this better than anyone. Living close to nature means paying attention to such changes. They know that today's abundance will not last forever. The green fields will eventually be harvested. Autumn will arrive. Winter will return. It always does. That knowledge gives the festival an unusual mixture of joy and melancholy. The people celebrate because life is good. They celebrate because they know it will not always remain so. As the sun rises above the forests and hills, final ceremonies take place. Some participants offer one last prayer. Others carry embers from the sacred fires back to their homes. These coals are treasured. Many believe they carry blessings and protection into the coming months. The sacred flame that united the tribe will now burn in individual households across the countryside. The great gathering slowly begins to dissolve. Families pack wagons, tents are dismantled, animals are gathered, friends say their farewells. Promises are made to meet again at the next great festival. Some promises will be kept, others will quietly disappear over the course of the year. Such is the way of human plans. By midday, the roads are busy once more. Travellers depart in every direction. The sacred groves grow quiet, the camps empty. The fields that recently echoed with music and celebration return to silence. Yet something remains. The memories, the friendships renewed, the marriages arranged, the stories exchanged, the prayers offered, the sense of belonging to a people connected by shared traditions stretching back through countless generations. For the Germanic tribes, midsummer was far more than a holiday. It was a celebration of community, nature, ancestry, and faith, a reminder that life moved in cycles, just as the sun moved across the sky. And every year, as the longest day arrived once more, the fires would be lit again, the songs would return, and another generation would gather beneath the endless summer light.